Hello, welcome to the 7th episode of this series. In this episode, we are going to round up everything regarding basic CSS and HTML. So far, we were able to build a simple landing page. Through that process, I'm sure you must have understood how HTML and CSS work together to create web pages. In this episode, we are going to add some final touches to our landing page by adding a contact page and adding a hover property to the buttons, and also customizing input fields. So in today's episode, we are going to cover the following: pseudo-classes and customizing an input field. Let's get started. So I already have the previous project open in VS Code. You can do the same. And for starters, let's go to index.html and try to open it with Lifesaver. Now once that is done, as you can see, it's the same project from the last episode. Now let's go back to our browser, to the VS Code, and move through to add a new contact page. So let's click on the add icon and call it contact.html. But before that, let's talk about pseudo-classes. So what is a pseudo-classes? Pseudo-classes are states in which a style can be added to an element. It's like a special state that we can style an element in. For example, we have this button over here. Now when I hover over this button, nothing happens. But there will be a time where we want to add special effects or special styling to a button once a mouse cursor hover over it. Now we can be able to add this using pseudo-classes. For example, let's go back to our style.css and find the outline button, which is this. So now we want to make the background color of the button to be green and the text color to be white. So we call the outlined button, and then we add a colon, and then everything after here is called a pseudo-class. For example, hover. Now we call our curly braces and then add the properties we want: background color, white, green, and color to be white. Now let's save this, go back to our browser. As you can see, once I hover over this button, it changes to green, and once I take my mouse off it, it goes back to white. Now this is styling an element using the pseudo-classes to style it in a defined state, which is this hovered, this. So now let's style the about button to be white when I hover over it. Now to do that, we won't go to the button directly and add the hover classes. No, we'll go back to our index.html and then target the button and give it a class name of a contained button. Now let's save this, go back to our CSS, and then call the contained button, then add our hover property, and then call the background color to be white, and then the text color to be green. Now let's save this, go back to our browser. Now as you can see, once I hover over this button, it changes to white. If I remove my mouse off it, it goes back to green, and the same with this contact button. Now we want to make our button very important, just like how this link elements are. For example, once we hover over this button, over this link, it changes to a pointer cursor. I want to have the same property in our buttons. Now all you have to do is go back to our buttons and add a property called cursor. Now let's give it a value of pointer, and now let's save this. Let's go back. Now our button has the pointer property. Now moving on, let's go back to our contact.html. It's empty. We can simply go back to our index.html, copy all the code, and then paste it inside. Now we have to remove every element inside the main tag, so excluding the div. So let's remove these elements, right, and then rename this to contacts container. Now let's save this, and let's go back, let's go up, change this link to / so that it can take us back to our home, to the landing page, and go back to the index.html and change the link here to contact.html so it can take us to the contact page. Now let's save this, let's go back. Now let's click on the contact page. As you can see, this is our contact page. There's nothing here. Let's click on this link again, takes us back to the home page. Now let's add this link scenario. on this contact button. And let's go back to index.html, locate the link button. Now you can do this by wrapping it in a link to a href equals to contact.html. Then let's save it. Now this is our contact button. Now once we click on it, it takes us back to the contact page. Let's click to go back, as you can see. Okay, now let's add an input field for the contact page. So let's go back to the contact page. In between the div tag, let's add our input field. You should have a type of text and a placeholder of name. Let's add another input field. Let's close it. Let's give it a type of email and a placeholder of email address. Now let's save this. Let's go back to the browser to see this. As you can see, our button is not very nice looking, and also we want it to be centered on the screen. Now to do that, let's go back to the browser, to the VS Code, go to the style.css, target the contact container. Let's give it a width of at least 40% of the screen. Now let's give it a border so that you can be able to see how it looks. Border solid gray. Now let's save this. Now let's go back to the browser. As you can see, this is where the div ends. As you can see, it's not barely half of the screen. Now let's go back. Let's center it to the screen. Let's give it a margin left of outer and a margin right of outer. Now this margin left of outer and margin right of outer, it's saying that we should give an automatic margin to the left and an automatic margin to the right, which then eventually brings the entire div to the center of the screen. Now let's save this, go back. Now as you can see, it is centered on the screen. Now let's style our input field. We want them to be on top of each other, not arranged horizontally. So now let's go back, go to the contact page. Let's give them a class name, class input field. Let's give it the same class name. Let's copy this and paste it here or here. Now let's copy this, go back to our style.css, let's target it and then give it a padding of at least 10 pixels. Now let's save this. As you can see, it's slightly bigger. Let's give it a display of block. Now initially all input elements are inline elements, but the display block property can change any element to a block element. Now let's save this. Now as you can see, we have our input field as block element. Now let's give it a margin so that they can be joined together like this. Let's go back, let's give it a margin of at least 20 pixels. Save this, go back. Now they are separated. Now we can be able to change properties like the outline color and also the text color. For example, this text color is purely black. Let's change the font size and also the color. So let's go back here and see font size. Let's give it 18 pixels. Let's save this. Let's go back. Now it's bigger. Now let's change the color by calling the color property and then giving it green. Now let's save this. This is what we have. Simple green color. Now I want to change the black border, the black outline to be green once an element is selected. For example, there's a difference between a border and an outline. For example, this is a border and this is an outline. An outline is outside the border. For example, let's go back. Let's change the border color to green. Let's save this. Now as you can see, we have a border color of green. Now once you select an element, the border color changes back to black because the outline is taken over. Now let's go back here and say outline color to green. Let's save this, and this is what we have. Now we have an outline color once an element is selected. Now let's increase the width of this input element so that it can fill the entire space of the container. So let's go back here and give it a width property of 100%. Now let's save this and go back. Now this is what we have. As you can see, it's slightly bigger and longer. Now let's give it labels so that users can be able to know what exactly those input fields entails. Let's go back to the contact.html and call the label property label. Let's save it, let's close it, and in between it will say full name. Now let's save this, go back. This is what we have. Let's add another label down here and give it email address. Let's save it, and this is what we have. Now our labels don't have margins, that's why they are not aligned with our input field. So we can go back to the style.css, but before that we need to give them a class name. Class name label. Let's give this a class name as well. Class name label. Let's save this. Let's go back. Let's call the label and then give it margin of 20 pixels and then a color of green. Now let's save this. Let's go back. Now this is what we have. We have our labels perfectly aligned with our input field. Now let's add a button, a submit button. Now let's go back. You can optionally go back to the contact.html and copy, the index.html and copy any button that we want. So we want the contain button. Now let's copy it, take it to the contact.html and add it below. Let's paste it here and then change the text to submit. Now let's save this. Let's go back. Now this is what we have. Now the button is bigger than what we want it to be, so we can reduce the size by giving it a new class name and say small button. Now let's save this, copy this and save this. Let's go back to the style.css and call the small button. Now we can reduce the padding to at least 10 pixels. Let's save this, go back. Now the button is a lot smaller, and we can reduce the font size to at least 15 pixels. Let's save this. Now the font size is a lot smaller. Now we can give it a margin of 20 pixels also. Margin of 20 pixels, so it can be perfectly aligned with our input field. And optionally we can change the font weight to bold, but let's do that. Font weight, let's give it value of 700.